At 17, Cal Briggs had $5, a sleeping bag with a broken zipper, and a name that meant nothing to anyone in Dunmore, Michigan. He'd been sleeping under the loading dock of a closed cannery for 11 days, eating from a gas station 2 blocks away, and telling himself this was temporary in the specific way you tell yourself things are temporary when you have run out of alternatives. The county tax auction that Thursday had one lot the bidding never reached, a flooded rail depot on the south end of town, assessed at $5 because the basement had been underwater for 3 years, and the roof had 2 holes in it, and the county had been trying to get rid of it since before Cal was born. He raised his hand. Nobody else did. But 2 weeks later, when he finally pried the cargo doors on the depot's east wall and stepped into the room beyond them, he found what Emmett Vane had spent 40 years building in the space where freight once waited for trains that no longer came. Something the whole town had been receiving without knowing where it came from. Something sealed behind iron doors that a 17-year-old boy with $5 and nowhere to go was apparently exactly the right person to find. The county auction was held in the parking lot of the township office, which was also the parking lot of the post office, which told you something about the scale of Dunmore's civic infrastructure. Before the auction, there was the cannery dock. Cal had arrived in Dunmore 11 days before the auction on a bus that stopped at the gas station on Route 31 and let him off in the parking lot at 7 a.m. He had no reason to be in Dunmore specifically. He had no reason to be anywhere specifically. He'd gotten on the bus in Grand Rapids because it was headed north, and he had the fare, and north meant fewer people who might recognize him from a situation he needed distance from. His stepfather's situation. The kind of situation a 17-year-old couldn't explain to a police officer without making it worse. Dunmore was a town of about 4,000 on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, the kind of place that had been built around an industry that left and hadn't quite figured out what to be afterward. The main street had a diner, a hardware store, a pharmacy, and 3 empty storefronts for every 2 occupied ones. The lake was visible at the end of 2 or 3 cross streets, gray-blue and enormous in January, the kind of water that made you feel small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. Cal had found the cannery dock the first night by following the lake smell south along the waterfront road until the buildings thinned out and the old fish cannery appeared, closed since the 1980s, its loading dock extending over the water on rusted pilings. The space under the dock was not warm. It was out of the wind, which in a northern Michigan January was close enough. He'd been sleeping there in the sleeping bag with the broken zipper, zipped as far as it would go and held shut with a bungee cord he'd found in a dumpster, and he'd been telling himself this was temporary in the specific way you tell yourself things are temporary when you have run out of alternatives. He had $38 when he arrived and had been spending carefully. A hot dog and a water from the gas station most mornings. A granola bar in the afternoon if he had it. He didn't have it most afternoons. He tried 3 different businesses on the main street about work in the first 4 days and been told no twice and nothing once. He'd been managing. That was the word for it. Managing. Cal had found the auction listing the same way he found most things that kept him alive that winter, by reading every notice on every bulletin board in a 3-block radius of wherever he was sleeping. He read them the way hungry people read menus, carefully, hopefully, without expecting much. The bulletin board outside the post office had the tax auction flyer tacked behind a notice for a lost dog and a flyer for a church rummage sale. He almost missed it. The listing was a single typed line. Lot 7, former Dunmore Rail Depot, 14 South Depot Street. Assessed value $5. Minimum bid $5. Structural condition non-habitable. Outstanding liens none. He'd read it 4 times. He had exactly $5.38. He'd been rationing it, $1 and some change each day, which covered a gas station hot dog and a bottle of water and left him nothing for emergencies. He'd been doing this for 11 days. He had maybe 4 days left at this rate before the $5 was gone, and the options narrowed to things he didn't want to think about yet. He walked to 14 South Depot Street. The depot was a brick building, 2 stories, built in the 1890s when the rail line through Dunmore was carrying iron ore south from the Upper Peninsula mines. The main hall was long and narrow, with tall arched windows that had been boarded over at some point and never unboarded. The platform along the east side was cracked and heaved by decades of frost. The roof had 2 holes that Cal could see from the street, the kind of holes that started as a loose slate and became a cave-in by the following spring if nobody stopped the process. The basement, he'd walked around the building and found the exterior stairs, was flooded to within 4 feet of the ceiling, a flat dark mirror of water that reflected the January sky. The cargo wing on the east side of the building was a separate structure, lower, with a flat built-up roof and a set of iron cargo doors set into the east wall. The doors were padlocked with a lock that had rusted around its shackle. The wood framing around the doors had swollen with moisture and then dried and then swollen again over many winters. But the iron doors themselves were solid, 3/8-inch plate, the kind of doors built to keep 100 years of weather out of a room full of freight. Cal stood in the January cold and looked at the building. It was derelict and flooded and had holes in the roof. It was also brick, which meant the walls weren't going anywhere. It was also his if he raised his hand at the auction, which was in 2 days and which would cost him exactly $5. He raised his hand. The auctioneer read the lot, announced the minimum bid, looked at the small crowd of farmers and investors and township employees, and waited. Nobody moved. Cal raised his hand. Going once, going twice. He paid $5 at the clerk's table and walked out of the parking lot holding a printout of a deed. He had 38 cents left. The first night in the depot was the coldest of his life and also the best sleep he'd had in 2 weeks. The basement was flooded, but the main hall was dry, cold, genuinely cold, the kind of cold that settles into brick buildings over the course of a northern Michigan winter and doesn't leave until May, but dry. He set up his sleeping bag in the corner furthest from the boarded windows, where the brick held some residual warmth from the south-facing wall. He ate the last of a sleeve of crackers he'd been rationing. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was pressed tin, the original 1890s installation, 12-foot panels in a repeating sunburst pattern. 3 of them had water stains from the roof leaks, but the rest were intact. In the yellow beam of his flashlight, the pressed tin threw small shadows from its raised pattern across the whole ceiling, like something old and deliberate and careful. Somebody had built this. He thought about that. Somebody had measured the ceiling panels and cut them and pressed them and installed them in a depot in a small Michigan town because they believed that a building where people came and went deserved something worth looking at while they waited. That person was long dead. The building was still here. The ceiling was still here. He fell asleep looking at the pressed tin ceiling. He was 17 years old. He had a building and 38 cents and no plan. In the morning, he would figure out the rest. The rest took 3 weeks to begin to take shape, and it began with water. The basement was the first problem because it was the foundation's problem. Cal spent the first 4 days learning the flood situation, where the water came from, how deep it was, whether it was moving or static. He borrowed a measuring tape from the hardware store 2 blocks away. The owner, a man named Tully, let him borrow tools without asking many questions, which Cal had learned was a particular kind of kindness that some people had and some people didn't. The water was static, not fed by an active leak, but by years of accumulated seepage through the foundation walls. The basement drain had been blocked by debris. Once he cleared the drain, 3 hours with a wire, working blind through the water, the level began to drop. Not fast, but down. He got a job the same week. The diner across the street from the depot needed someone to wash dishes from 6 to 10 in the morning and from 5 to 9 in the evening. The owner was a woman named Cecil Marsh, 68, who had been running the diner for 31 years and who looked at Cal the first morning he came in and asked for work with the particular directness of someone who had hired enough people to know what she was looking at. "How old are you?" she said. "17. Where do you live?" He hesitated for exactly 1 second. "The depot," he said. Cecil looked at him. She looked out the diner window at the depot across the street. She looked back at him. That flooded building, the basement's draining. She studied him for another moment. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of him, and said, 6 to 10, 5 to 9, $40 a day, bring your own lunch. He started that morning. Cecil's diner was called Marsh's and had been in the same location since 1971, and had a counter with 8 stools and 6 booths, and a menu that hadn't changed substantially since Reagan was president, which the regulars considered a feature rather than a problem. Cecil worked the counter herself from open to close, 7 days a week, with a part-time cook named Bert who came in for the lunch rush. She was a compact, precise woman who moved through the diner with the efficiency of someone who had made every possible mistake decades ago and no longer needed to make any of them. She kept her coffee hot and her opinions brief, and she watched Cal across the street through the diner window every evening when she was closing up. Cal noticed. He didn't say anything about it. By the end of the second week, the basement was down to 8 inches of standing water, and the drain was running clear. He'd found a shop vac at a yard sale and was pulling the last of the standing water section by section, working from the dry edges inward. The main hall he'd swept twice and mopped once, the mop water going a color that suggested decades of accumulated soot and grime. The pressed tin ceiling was intact. The floor was maple hardwood under the grime, old-growth maple, the kind that didn't warp. He'd patched the smaller of the 2 roof holes with a sheet of EPDM membrane he found in the building's utility closet, still in its packaging from a repair that had apparently been planned but never executed. The larger hole would need actual roofing. He was working on the roof when he first noticed the cargo doors. He'd been past them a dozen times. They were set into the east wall of the cargo wing, 2 iron doors each about 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, on heavy pivot hinges. The padlock was a standard hardware store model from maybe 30 years ago, but the doors themselves were not. They were original to the building, cast iron, framed in the same brick as the rest of the structure, and someone had at some point sealed the gap between the doors and the frame with a bead of metallic caulk that had cured to the hardness of the iron around it. Not just padlocked, sealed. He'd noticed the padlock and assumed the cargo room was empty storage. The seal was something different. The seal was deliberate. He borrowed Tully's bolt cutters and went through the padlock in 2 minutes. The caulk bead took an hour with a cold chisel and a hammer, working slowly so as not to damage the frame. When the last of the seal broke free, the doors swung outward on their pivot hinges with a low, deep sound that had nothing mechanical about it, more like the sound a room makes when it remembers it has air. He stepped through. The cargo room was about 30 feet deep and 20 wide, with a concrete floor that was completely dry. The cargo wing's foundation was above the water table, separate from the main building's basement. The air inside was cold and dry and smelled of iron and old wood and something else he couldn't name, something between oil and heated metal, the ghost of a working shop. Against the back wall was a forge, not a decorative antique. A working forge, a cast iron firepot set into a brick surround, with a hand-crank blower on an iron post beside it. The blower was dusty, but the mechanism was intact. An anvil stood on a hardwood block to the right of the forge, a 150-pound London pattern anvil with a smooth, flat face and a horn that caught the light from Cal's flashlight. The wall above the forge was a pegboard, the same outline tool system Cal had seen in old machine shops, each tool's outline painted in red so you'd know if anything was missing. The tools were all there. Hammers of 4 different weights, from a 2-pound cross peen to a 10-pound sledge, tongs in 5 sizes, hardy tools slotted into the anvil's hardy hole, swages, fullers, punches, every tool in its place, outlined in red, dusty but unrusted. Whoever had left this room had left it as if they expected to come back. Cal walked to the forge and ran his hand along the iron firepot. Cool, dry, he worked the blower handle. The mechanism turned smoothly, the gearing clean, the bearings barely stiff despite the years. On the workbench along the south wall, under a canvas tarp that had kept the dust off, were 3 more objects: a leather-bound ledger, a ring of keys, and a coffee tin with a folded piece of paper tucked into the lid. Cal unfolded the paper. It was handwriting, a large, deliberate cursive that pressed hard into the page. If you're reading this, you found the room. That means you found the building, which means you were supposed to. Leave the tools where they are until you know what they're for. The ledger will explain some of it. The keys open the cabinet above the workbench and the lockbox at the Dunmore Savings on Main. The account number is written on the smallest key. My name is Emmett Vane. I was the last station master here, and after that the last blacksmith. Come find me if I'm still alive. If I'm not, then everything in this room belongs to whoever found it, and I hope that person has good hands. Cal looked at the date on the note, 12 years ago. He'd been 5 years old. He looked at the ring of keys. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the forge and the anvil and the outline tools on the wall. He sat down on the edge of the workbench and stayed there for a long time. He came back the next morning before his dishwashing shift. He opened the ledger. It was an account, the kind kept by a businessman or a tradesman, organized by name and date and amount. But the amounts were not invoices, they were gifts. The format was the same for every entry: a name, a date, a description of the need, and a column at the right margin headed simply, "Done. January 1974. Cowoksik Stan. Coal delivery 2 tons, prepaid through the fuel yard on 3rd. His furnace blew out in December and he's got 3 kids under 10. Done. March 1975. Phelps Delors, school fees, spring semester, 2 kids. Her husband left in February. Done. August 1976. Ray's Archero, equipment repair on his welding rig. Did the repair myself, charged him for the rod only. He's building his own business and he doesn't need the overhead. Done. The entries ran forward from 1974 through the late 2000s, when the handwriting grew larger and less regular. Emmett Vane had been keeping this ledger for over 30 years, recording every act of help given from this cargo room and from the blacksmithing business he'd run inside it. The forge was the engine. Cal understood it now, reading the ledger. After the rail line stopped running freight through Dunmore in the 1970s, Emmett had quietly converted the cargo wing into a blacksmith shop. He'd contracted with farms, with the machine shops that were still operating in the county, with anyone who needed ironwork done. He charged fair rates and kept the business lean and put the margin toward the people who appeared in the ledger. For 30 years, the cargo room had been a forge and an account book and a supply of quiet help, visible to the town as a blacksmith shop and invisible to the town as anything else. Cal read for 2 hours. He was late to his dishwashing shift. Cecil didn't say anything when he came in, flushed and slightly out of breath. After the morning shift, he went back. He found the cabinet above the workbench and opened it with one of the keys from the ring. Inside were 4 shelves of organized documentation: permits, equipment records, a folder of business contacts going back to the 1970s, and a single manila envelope labeled in Emmett's large cursive. For whoever finds this, read before the bank. Inside the envelope was a letter. It ran to 6 pages, on the same heavy paper as the note in the coffee tin, in the same deliberate pressing hand. Cal, I don't know your name, so I'm calling you that because I've been calling you that in my head for a while. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that you found the room, which means something led you here, and in my experience, something leading a person to a place like this is not usually coincidence. I want to tell you about the depot. I started working here in 1968 when I was 22 and the rail line was still running ore. I was the assistant station master for 4 years and then the station master for another 8. When the line stopped running freight in 1979, the railroad company locked the building and left. The county took it on taxes a few years later and tried to sell it twice. Nobody wanted it. I did. I didn't have much money. What I had was the use of the cargo wing, which the county let me lease for almost nothing because having someone on the property kept the vandals out. I've been blacksmithing since I was a boy, my father's trade, and I set up the forge in the cargo room and started doing work. Farm implements, gates, structural ironwork, anything anyone needed that required fire and iron and a pair of hands that knew what they were doing. The work paid, not extravagantly, but it paid and I didn't need much. What I did need and what I want to tell you about is the town. Dunmore was dying when the rail line left. The ore trade had been the life of this county for 80 years, and when it pulled out, it took jobs and families and money and left behind the people who couldn't leave and the buildings they were living in. I watched it happen. I watched families I'd known my whole life make decisions about whether to heat the house or feed the kids, whether to pull the oldest one out of school because the fees were past due, whether to let the farm equipment sit because the repair would cost more than they had. I decided I wasn't going to watch without doing something, so I did something. Not a lot, a little at a time for a long time. I kept the account because I wanted to know whether it mattered and because I thought that someday someone should know what had been attempted here, even if that person turned out to be nobody. Here is what I need you to know about the tools. The forge is a working forge. The tools are a working set. Everything is maintained and in order. The skills are learnable. You don't have to have been raised to this work. I wasn't not fully, but I learned and so can you. There are books on the shelf below the workbench. There are contacts in the folder in the cabinet, people in this county who knew my work and trusted it and will trust work that comes from this shop if you treat them right. The blacksmith's trade is not glamorous, but it is useful in a way that does not go out of fashion. There will always be iron that needs shaping, hinges that need making, work that requires heat and a hammer and someone who knows what they're doing. The account at the Dunmore Savings has money in it, not a fortune. Enough to repair the roof, dry out the basement, get the building functional, and have something left over to start. I put it there for whoever found this room. I had no children of my own and my family is gone. The building and the account and the tools belong to you. One more thing. There is an entry in the ledger I want you to read. It is the only entry in the ledger with no mark in the done column. It is dated September 1982. It is there because I wrote down everything, including the one time I said no and why. That no is going to matter to you. I don't know exactly how, but I know it will. Find it and read it. And if you light the forge, light it properly. Good coke, not charcoal. Tongs before you touch anything hot. Let the steel come to color before you work it. I hope you have good hands. Emmett Vane Cal sat with the letter on the workbench for a long time. He sat with it the way you sit with something that is larger than you expected and that you need to be careful handling. He'd been handed larger things before, bad things, the kind that come suddenly and leave you in a parking lot at 7 in the morning with a bag and a bus ticket and no plan. But those were things that happened to you. This was something someone had built deliberately and left for whoever came. He thought about the timeline. Emmett had written the cabinet note 12 years ago when Cal was 5. He'd set up the bank account in 1988 before Cal was born. He'd started the ledger in 1974. He'd been running this operation, the forge, the account, the quiet help, for over 30 years before he wrote the note. He'd written it and sealed the room and gone to the care facility and died, trusting that the room would be found by someone who could use it. He didn't know Cal Briggs existed. He didn't know anyone specific existed. He'd built the whole thing on the assumption that the right person would eventually show up. Not because he knew who the right person was, but because he understood that the right kind of person and the right kind of place found each other, eventually, if the place was left available. Cal thought about the $5, about the bulletin board, about the auction that nobody else bid at. He thought about the cannery dock and 11 days in the cold and the particular arithmetic of a person at the absolute floor of what's available to them. Emmett had priced the building at $5. It wasn't the county that had priced it. The county used a structural assessment to set the assessed value, but somebody had set the minimum bid. He'd assumed it was the county. Looking at the letter now, at the bank account set up in 1988, at the 30 years of careful preparation, he wondered. He'd look into that later. Cal set the letter down. He picked up the ledger. Then he opened it to September 1982. He found the entry. September 1982. Stokes, Gerald. Request declined. Gerald Stokes came to the shop asking for a loan of $800 against his development plans for the south end of town. He wants to buy up the empty lots along Depot Street and build commercial. I said no. I said no because I know Gerald Stokes. I've watched him operate in this county for 15 years. He buys where things are vulnerable and holds what he buys until it's worth more and sells without regard for what was there before. He has never put $1 into Dunmore that he didn't intend to take $3 out of, and the people on the taking end of his transactions have never been the people in this ledger. They have been the people in this ledger. I help anyone who needs it. Gerald Stokes does not need $800. He wants $800 to do harm with. That is a different thing, and I will not put my name to it. He will remember. Cal closed the ledger. He set it on the workbench. He looked at Emmett's note. That no is going to matter to you. I don't know exactly how, but I know it will. He thought about the name, Stokes. He'd seen it somewhere in the past 3 weeks. He went through his memory of the bulletin boards, the township notices, the flyers. Then he had it. The week before the tax auction, there had been a notice pinned to the township board, a preliminary infrastructure survey, a proposal for the clearance of several properties along South Depot Street to accommodate a commercial redevelopment plan. The proposal was submitted by a firm called Stokes Development Group. Cal went back to the township board that afternoon. The notice was still there. Stokes Development Group, proposing the condemnation and demolition of 3 properties on South Depot Street, including the former rail depot, on the grounds of structural non-habitability and public safety hazard. The proposal had been submitted 4 months ago and was pending a county engineering review scheduled for the following month. Cal read the notice twice. Then he went back to the depot and lit the forge. Not to work. Not yet. He stood at the forge with the blower running and watched the coke come to temperature and felt the heat build outward from the firepot and thought. Emmett Vane had built something in this room over 30 years. He had kept a record of it. He had sealed it behind iron doors and left it for whoever came. He had refused a man named Gerald Stokes and written down why, and told whoever found it that the refusal would matter. Gerald Stokes had been dead for 20 years probably. His grandson or his son was running the firm now, and they had been trying to clear this property for long enough that the condemnation proposal had been drafted before Cal arrived, which meant Stokes Development didn't know yet that someone had bought the building. Cal shut the blower down. The forge cooled slowly. He went across the street to Cecile's diner. Cecile was at the counter with her closing cloth, wiping down the coffee station. She looked up when he came in. She'd been watching him come and go from the depot for 3 weeks now. She'd seen the cargo doors open. She'd seen him come out with the ledger. She'd watched him cross the street with the expression of a boy who had just been handed something very large and wasn't sure yet how to carry it. She set down the cloth and poured 2 cups. He told her about the ledger. He told her about Emmett's letter. He told her about the forge and the account and the tools in their outlined places on the pegboard. He told her about September 1982 and Gerald Stokes, and then he told her about the condemnation notice. Cecile listened to all of it without speaking. She held her coffee cup in both hands and watched him with the focused attention of someone filing everything into its proper place. When he finished, she set her cup down. "Emmett Vane," she said. She said it the same way Me Cutler had said Walter's name, the same way Delia Hurst had said Clem's, with the weight of someone placing it in its proper context, the context of everything they already knew and had never quite assembled into a single shape until now. "I've been across this street for 31 years, Cecile said. "I watched Emmett go in and out of that cargo door every day he was working. I knew he was smithing. I knew he had contracts in the county." She looked at her cup. "I didn't know about the ledger. I suspected something. You don't watch a man as long as I watched Emmett without knowing that he was more than what he said, but I didn't know. Is he alive? He went into a care facility in Traverse City about 7 years ago. I heard he passed 2 or 3 years after that." She looked at Cal directly. "Which means whatever he built in that room, he built it for you. He built it for whoever found it. He didn't know me." "No," Cecile said, "but he described you. In the letter, good hands, someone who was supposed to find it, someone who needed it." She tilted her head. "How many 17-year-olds do you think have been through a county tax auction in this town?" Cal didn't answer. "You were exactly who he was building it for," Cecile said. "He just didn't know your name." She poured more coffee. "Now tell me again about the Stokes notice," she said. "Because I've been watching that family work this county since Emmett was alive, and I have things to tell you about them." Gerald Stokes had been a developer in Dunmore for decades before his death. His grandson, Merritt Stokes, had taken over the firm 15 years ago and had been systematically buying up the south end of town, the old industrial blocks, the rail corridor, the lots that had gone empty when the ore trade left. He developed some of it, sold some, and was currently holding the corridor on which South Depot Street sat for a commercial redevelopment project that had been in the planning stages for years. The depot was the last piece he needed. It sat in the middle of the corridor like a tooth that hadn't been pulled. He tried to buy it through the county years ago and been told it wasn't for sale. He tried to get it condemned on safety grounds, and the report had been inconclusive. He'd filed the current infrastructure clearance proposal 4 months ago, the same week the county had listed it in the tax auction, perhaps believing nobody would bid on a flooded derelict. Nobody had bid, except Cal. He doesn't know you own it, Cecil said. The deed was filed at the county clerk's office the same day. Merritt Stokes doesn't read the deed filings, Cecil said. He has people who watch for things he's interested in. He doesn't know yet. She looked at the window at the depot visible across the street through the January dark. When he finds out, he'll file the condemnation anyway. He'll argue the sale was improper, or that you bought a condemned property without disclosure, or that the public safety grounds still apply regardless of ownership. Can he do that? He can try. Cecil folded her hands on the counter. You need a lawyer. I can't afford a lawyer. I know one who will want to hear about this ledger, Cecil said. She was born in Dunmore. Her family is in that ledger. I'd bet my diner on it. The attorney's name was Ingrid Palonen, 54, who had grown up in Dunmore and practiced in Traverse City. She drove down on a Saturday, walked through the depot twice, stood in the cargo room for a long time looking at the forge and the tools in their outlines, and then sat at the workbench and read Emmett's letter and the relevant pages of the ledger without saying anything. Her family's entry was from 1991, Palonen Vaco, medical debt, Munson Hospital, $1,200. His wife had surgery in July. He's been working double shifts at the mill and it's not enough. Paid directly to the hospital billing office. Told them it was from a community fund. Done. Ingrid read the entry twice. She set the ledger down with both hands. My father worked double shifts for 8 months after my mother's surgery, she said. He never found out where the bill went. He thought the hospital had written it off. She looked at the entry. He died thinking that. Cal didn't say anything. He would have wanted to know, she said. He was a proud man. He would have wanted to know so he could figure out how to give it back. She was quiet for a moment. That's exactly why Emmett didn't tell him. She looked at Cal. Show me the condemnation notice. He showed her. She read it, read it again, made notes on a legal pad she'd brought. The structural non-habitability claim is the spine of this, she said. Stokes needs an independent engineering report to support condemnation. They have one scheduled. Before that report is filed, you need your own. How do I pay for it? The account at Dunmore Savings, she said. Have you been to the bank yet? He hadn't. He'd been working up to it. The key was on the ring. They went together that afternoon. The account had been opened by Emmett Vane in 1988 and had been accruing interest since the last deposit, which Emmett had made in 2009, 3 years before he went to the care facility. The balance was $43,000 and change. Ingrid looked at the balance on the bank statement. That's enough, she said, for the engineer, for the legal work, and for the roof repair. Cal looked at the statement. $43,000. Built in a cargo room forge over 30 years of blacksmithing contracts, saved dollar by dollar in the same discipline that produced the ledger entries. A little room on the edges always, and someone who needed that room more than the edges did. He built this, Cal said. He built it for this, Ingrid said. There's a difference. He built it for exactly the situation you're in. Here is where the story turns. Subscribe if you want to see how far it goes, because it goes further than you think. Merritt Stokes found out about the sale 3 days after Cal and Ingrid visited the bank. His attorney sent a letter that arrived certified mail, addressed to current occupant, 14 South Depot Street. Cal opened it at the workbench in the cargo room, beside the ledger, with the forge at his back. The letter asserted that the property transfer was invalid because the county had not properly disclosed the pending condemnation proceedings at the time of the tax auction. It requested that Cal cease occupancy and surrender the deed pending a county review. It was signed by an attorney in Traverse City whom Ingrid, when Cal called her, recognized immediately. "Stokes's firm has been using that attorney for 20 years," she said. "He's good. He'll file the condemnation motion within the week. Can the county take the building back? Not if the sale was properly conducted." And it was. The county listed the property without restriction, set a minimum bid, accepted the bid. Their own records show no active condemnation order at the time of sale. The pending proposal wasn't an order. It was a proposal. She paused. But Merritt is going to argue that the county had a duty to disclose the proposal and that a 17-year-old buyer couldn't have understood what he was purchasing. Cal had understood exactly what he was purchasing. He'd read the listing 4 times. "Get me a sworn statement from the county clerk confirming the status of the condemnation proposal at the time of sale," Ingrid said. "And get Tully at the hardware store to document any contact he's had with you about the building, work you've done, materials you've purchased, repairs you've made. I want a record showing this building has been actively maintained since you took ownership." Tully cooperated without hesitation. He pulled his records, every tool Cal had borrowed, every piece of material he'd bought on credit that he'd paid back from his dish-washing wages, and compiled them in a folder that he handed to Ingrid with the same calm as a man handing over something he'd been waiting to have a use for. "I knew Emmett," Tully said. "My grandfather is in that ledger. 1978. The hardware store was about to go under. Emmett bought 6 months of inventory on credit and paid it on time and then some." He looked at the folder. "I've been keeping an eye on that building since Emmett left. I'm glad someone bought it." The county clerk's statement confirmed that the condemnation proposal had been in proposal status, not order status, at the time of sale. The county had not been required to disclose it. The sale had been properly conducted. Ingrid filed a declaratory judgment motion that Friday. The motion asked the court to confirm Cal's title and rule that the condemnation proposal could not retroactively affect a properly completed sale. Stokes's attorney responded the following week with a motion to expedite the condemnation engineering review and a request for a temporary restraining order preventing any structural modification to the property pending resolution. The TRO was denied. Cal kept working. He'd started on the roof the week of Ingrid's first visit, with money from the account. He hired a roofing contractor from the next town, Cecil had recommended him, who came out, looked at the 2 holes, looked at the rest of the roof, and gave Cal a number that was within the account's capacity. The contractor's crew worked for 4 days in February cold, replacing the damaged sections and resealing the perimeter. When they finished, the roof was sound for the first time in years. The basement continued to drain. By the 3rd week of February, it was down to dry. Cal ran a dehumidifier in the space for 2 weeks and then walked the walls with a flashlight, checking for active seepage. There was none. The foundation was sound. He was learning the forge. Emmett's books were on the shelf below the workbench, 4 of them, 2 on basic blacksmithing technique, 1 on toolmaking, 1 on decorative ironwork, and Cal read them at night after his dish-washing shifts, sitting on a stool at the workbench with the books open beside the ledger. He studied the diagrams. He read the descriptions of heat colors and hammer angles and the way iron moves when it's properly worked versus when it's not. He read the sections on the forge itself, on coke versus charcoal, on how to build and manage a fire that would give him the heat he needed without burning the steel. He read until the words went sideways and then he slept, and in the morning before his shift, he came back and read some more. He also hit a wall in the 3rd week of February. The main hall floor, the old-growth maple he'd been carefully cleaning, had a section near the center where the boards had swollen and buckled from years of moisture infiltration from the roof leaks. He'd known the section was damaged. He hadn't known how damaged. When he pulled the buckled boards to assess the extent, he found that the subfloor beneath them had rotted through in a 4-foot section, the joists soft and crumbling at the ends where they met the sill plate. He sat on the edge of the hole and looked at it. He didn't have the money for a structural repair. He hadn't touched the account yet. Ingrid had told him to wait until the legal situation was clearer before drawing against it, and he'd been managing on his dish-washing wages. A proper joist repair would need a carpenter, materials, a full day of work. He had $32 in his wallet and 4 days until his next paycheck. He sat with it for a long time. Then he went to Tully's. Tully listened to the description of the damage, asked 3 questions, and came back the next morning with a section of lumber in his truck bed. He spent 4 hours in the main hall with Cal, pulling the damaged joists, sistering new lumber to the sound sections, and setting the subfloor on solid support. He took nothing for the work except the coffee Cal made him from a tin he'd found in the cargo room cabinet. "Emmett helped my grandfather keep this hardware store open," Tully said, nailing the last sister board. "That store put my father through college, and my father put me through college, and I own the store now. You can have a day of framing." He left before Cal could say what he needed to say about it. On a Saturday morning in late February, with nobody watching, Cal lit the forge for the first time. He did it the way Emmett's letter said. Good coke, not charcoal, the blower turning slow and steady until the coke caught and the firepot glowed red, and then orange and then yellow-white at its core. He let the heat build. He put on the heaviest leather apron he'd found in the cabinet and the face shield and the heavy gloves. He picked up the 2-pound cross-peen hammer and felt the weight of it settle into his palm. He'd found a piece of scrap mild steel in the cabinet, a rod about a foot long, half an inch in diameter, and he pushed it into the fire with the tongs and waited for it to come to color. Orange. Not yet, he watched. The steel deepened through orange-red to a bright orange. He watched it move toward yellow. He pulled it from the fire and set it on the anvil. The first hammer blow was tentative. The steel moved slightly. The second was more confident. The third was right. The weight dropped through the hammer handle into the steel, and the metal upset slightly under the face, flattening and spreading the way it was supposed to. He worked the rod for 30 seconds before it lost heat and went back into the fire. He kept going for 2 hours. By the end he had something that was recognizable as an S-hook, rough and uneven but structurally sound, which he'd made by upsetting, drawing out, and curling both ends of the rod around the horn of the anvil. He held it in the tongs and looked at it. It was not beautiful. It was a beginning. He hung it on the peg at the bottom of the pegboard below the outline tools where there was a blank hook with nothing assigned to it. Emmett had left that peg empty. Cal thought he knew why. Cecil saw it from across the street, the smoke from the forge stack. She came over at noon. She stood in the cargo room doorway looking at the forge with its fire banked, the anvil, the outline tools, the boy standing in a leather apron beside the workbench. Emmett used to say the forge was the most honest thing in the building, she said. You put the iron in and it tells you exactly what temperature it is. It doesn't lie. Cal set the tongs down. Did you know him well? Well enough. She came into the room and looked at the tools on the pegboard. He came to the diner every morning for coffee. Every morning for 25 years. Always the same seat, the end stool. Never stayed long, never talked about himself. She touched the edge of the workbench. He used to say when somebody asked him why he was still in Dunmore when all the ore trade was gone and the town was half empty, he used to say, somebody has to hold the door open. She looked at Cal. I think he meant literally, she said, and also not. The engineering report came back in March. The independent structural engineer Cal had hired through Ingrid's recommendation had spent 2 days in the building, testing the foundation, testing the roof structure, testing the masonry. His report was 14 pages. The summary was clear. The building was structurally sound. The foundation had no active water infiltration. The roof repair was adequate. The historic masonry was intact and not at risk. The building was not a public safety hazard. Stokes's engineer filed his own report 1 week later. It focused on the basement, which had been flooded for 3 years before Cal's purchase, and argued that the water infiltration had compromised the foundation mortar. Ingrid filed a rebuttal that included 3 things: Cal's documentation of the basement drainage work, the before and after photographs Tully had helped him take when the basement was first dry, and an addendum from the independent engineer addressing the foundation mortar specifically. The foundation mortar was original 1890s Portland cement. It had been underwater for 3 years. It was fine. The hearing was scheduled for April. Cal kept working. He was doing 2 hours at the forge every morning before his dish-washing shift, with Emmett's books open on the workbench. He'd made a dozen S-hooks, then a set of drive hooks for a barn door, then a simple hinge that he'd taken apart and analyzed and made again 3 times until the geometry was right. He wasn't good yet. He was getting the feel. The contacts in Emmett's folder were still in the cabinet. He hadn't called any of them. He wasn't ready to call them yet. But he'd read through the folder twice, and he understood that Emmett had spent 30 years building a reputation in this county, and that reputation was sitting in a manila folder on a shelf waiting for someone to carry it forward. He'd need to earn the right to that. He understood that. You didn't inherit a reputation. You built one, using the same material as the person before you, but the material was there. Cecile brought him lunch most days, a plate from the diner that she said was leftover from the rush, which he suspected was not always true. She sat on the stool at the workbench while he ate and told him things about Dunmore, about the families in the ledger, about what the town had been and what it had become. She had 31 years of institutional memory and a way of carrying it that was not nostalgic. She didn't mourn the ore trade. She didn't pretend the town hadn't changed. She just knew the place the way you know a person, not perfectly but truly, the way that includes their faults and their history and their particular way of holding on. On a Thursday in late March, 2 weeks before the hearing, a man Cal didn't know came to the depot. He drove a new truck, the expensive kind, and he parked it with the precision of someone who had grown up parking expensive things. He was in his 50s, dressed for an office but wearing boots, and he walked around the building once before he knocked on the cargo room door. "You're the kid who bought this," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm the owner," Cal said. The man looked at him. He had the measured stillness of someone who had spent a long time dealing with situations by calculating them first. "Merritt Stokes," he said. Cal had thought about this moment. He'd thought about what to say, what not to say, how to stand. He'd asked Ingrid what to do if Stokes came in person. She'd said, "Listen, don't agree to anything, don't sign anything, call me." "I know who you are," Cal said. Stokes looked past him at the cargo room, the forge, the anvil, the tools. His expression was careful, not surprised exactly, more like a man who has been told something and is now confirming it with his own eyes. "You've been working the forge," Stokes said. "Yes." "Emmett Vane's forge." Cal didn't answer. Stokes put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the building around them, the brick walls and the pressed tin ceiling visible through the cargo room door to the main hall. He had the look of a man calculating, but also something else underneath the calculation, something older and less comfortable. "My grandfather came to Emmett once," Stokes said. "In 1982, asked for a loan." "I know," Cal said. Stokes looked at him directly. "He kept a record." He kept a record of everything. A silence. The forge was banked and quiet. The lake effect wind moved around the building's corners with a sound that had been there since 1896 and would be there long after both of them were gone. "What's it worth to you?" Stokes said. It was not a question about money, or not only about money. It was the question that a man asks when he has arrived at a place he has been avoiding for a long time and is still not sure what he finds there. "The building," Cal said. "The ledger," Cal looked at him. "The ledger isn't for sale." Stokes looked at the pegboard, at the outline tools, at the S-hook Cal had hung on the empty peg his first morning at the forge. His face did something that was not quite readable, not calculation, something that had more age in it. "He refused my grandfather," Stokes said, "and my grandfather held it for the rest of his life, passed it down." He paused. "I grew up knowing Emmett Vane had said no to my family. I grew up being told that was the reason Dunmore never came back, because the people who could have invested in it chose instead to hold on to a broken-down depot and a grudge." Cal thought about the ledger entry. "He buys where things are vulnerable and holds what he buys until it's worth more and sells without regard for what was there before. The people on the taking end of his transactions have never been the people in this ledger." "Did you read the entry?" Cal asked. The reason he said no. Stokes was quiet for a long moment. "My attorney got a copy of the relevant pages as part of the legal discovery." "Then you know why he said no." Another silence. "I'm not my grandfather," Stokes said. "I know," Cal said, "but you've been trying to clear this building for years. You've been working on a condemnation order that was drafted before I bought the property. That's not nothing." Stokes looked at the floor. He was a man who had arrived somewhere and found it different from what he'd expected. That happened, Cal thought, when you spent a long time avoiding something. The thing grew and the avoidance took on a shape that wasn't its real shape, and when you finally got close enough to see it clearly, the real shape was both smaller and more complicated than the version you'd been carrying. "What are you going to do with this place?" Stokes asked. Cal looked at the forge, at the anvil, at the tools in their outlined places. "Learn to use what's in it," he said, "and keep the door open." Stokes looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way a person nods when they have heard something they cannot argue with. He walked out of the cargo room and down the platform steps and got back into his truck. Cal watched the truck pull away from the curb. He went across to the diner. Cecile was at the counter. She'd seen the truck. She poured 2 cups without asking. Cal told her. Cecile listened and set her cup down. "Is he going to withdraw the condemnation motion?" "I don't know. Maybe." Cal thought about Stokes's face, the calculation behind the eyes and underneath it the older thing. Maybe not, but something changed. "Something changed," Cecile repeated. She picked up her cup. "That's more than the hearing will do, probably. The hearing settles the legal question. What happened this morning is different." "What happened this morning?" "He had to say his grandfather's name out loud," Cecile said. "In the building Emmett Vane built, looking at the record Emmett kept." She looked at the window at the depot across the street. "That costs something. For some people, that's where things begin to shift." The hearing was in April in the county seat 20 miles north of Dunmore. The courtroom was smaller than Ingrid had expected, she said, but the gallery was full. Cecile was there. Tully was there with his folder of documentation. A man named Kowalczyk, whose father was the first entry in the ledger, had driven 2 hours. A retired schoolteacher named Reyes, whose father was in the ledger, had come from outside Traverse City. 6 other people whose family names appeared in Emmett's account had heard about the hearing through the same quiet network that county news always traveled, and they'd come. Cal sat at the respondents' table with Ingrid. Stokes sat across the room with his attorney. Stokes had not withdrawn the motion. But 2 days before the hearing, his attorney had filed an amended motion that significantly narrowed the condemnation claim, dropping the safety hazard argument and focusing solely on the procedural question of whether the county had an obligation to disclose the pending proposal at the time of sale. Ingrid had read the amended motion and said, "He's retreating." "Why?" "Because he looked at the ledger and he calculated the cost of having it read aloud in a county courtroom," Ingrid said. "The amended motion is him trying to win on procedure instead of on the substance, but he's going to lose on procedure too." She was right. The county clerk's testimony confirmed the status of the proposal at the time of sale. It was a pending proposal, not a filed order, and carried no disclosure obligation. The independent engineering report confirmed the building's structural soundness. Tully's documentation confirmed active maintenance. Ingrid argued concisely and without drama, and at the end she asked permission to introduce Emmett Vane's letter to the court, not as legal evidence but as context for the purpose and character of the property at issue. The judge permitted it. Ingrid read 2 paragraphs aloud. "The town was dying when the rail line left. I watched families make decisions about whether to heat the house or feed the kids. I decided I wasn't going to watch without doing something." The gallery was very quiet. Then Ingrid read the September 1982 entry, all of it, including "I help anyone who needs it." Gerald Stokes does not need $800. He wants $800 to do harm with. Stokes's attorney did not object. Stokes himself looked at the table. The judge asked if the claimant wished to offer further argument. Stokes's attorney said after a pause, "The claimant withdraws the condemnation motion, Your Honor." The gallery exhaled. The judge looked at Stokes, then at Cal. "Condemnation proposal is withdrawn. The plaintiff's title to the property at 14 South Depot Street, Dunmore, is confirmed. This matter is closed." Outside the courthouse, in the April wind off the lake, Ingrid shook Cal's hand. Cecile hugged him. Tully nodded and went to his truck. The man named Kowalczyk, whose father was the first entry in the ledger, shook Cal's hand with a grip that said more than the words he used, which were, "My father would have liked knowing." Cal drove back to Dunmore alone. He parked on Depot Street and walked to the cargo room and lit the forge, and stood in front of it while the coke caught and the fire built, and the heat came forward into the cold Michigan afternoon. He had a building. He had a forge. He had a record of 40 years of generosity in a leather-bound ledger and $43,000 that Emmett Vane had built out of blacksmithing contracts and saved for exactly this. He had the tools in their outlined places on the pegboard. And he had the empty peg. 2 weeks after the hearing, he called the first name from Emmett's folder, a farm equipment supplier outside Traverse City, a man named Rianikinen who had been in Emmett's contact list since 1986 and who, when Cal explained who he was and where he was calling from, went quiet for a moment. "Emmett's shop," he said. "I heard someone bought the depot." "I bought it," Cal said. "I've been learning the forge." "How long?" "Since February." "What can you make?" "Hooks, drive hooks, hinges. Simple ironwork. I'm working on more." Rianikinen was quiet again. "Emmett was the best blacksmith in this county for 30 years, he said. "I've been going to a shop in Petoskey since he left. They're all right. Not Emmett." He paused. "Come out Thursday. Bring a piece of work. I want to see your hands." Cal went out Thursday. He brought the hinge set he'd made, the third iteration, the one where the geometry was finally right, and the hooks and a simple latch he'd made the week before. Rianikinen looked at the work for a long time. He turned the hinge over. He worked the pin. He looked at the proportions, the finish of the faces, the way the knuckle had been formed. "You made this yourself," he said. "Yes." "How long have you been doing this?" 7 weeks. Rianikinen looked at him. 7 weeks. He set the hinge down. "You have good hands," he said. He gave Cal a contract for Gate Hardware. 12 sets delivered by June. Cal drove back to Dunmore in the late afternoon with the contract in the passenger seat. The lake was visible from the highway, gray, blue, and wide, the same lake that had been there when the ore boats ran, and when the depot was full of freight, and when Emmett Vane had stood at that forge for 30 years keeping a county together, one quiet act at a time. He parked on Depot Street and went inside. Cecile was closing the diner. She saw his truck and came to the window and saw his face and nodded once and went back to closing up. She brought coffee over 20 minutes later, 2 cups, and sat on the stool at the workbench. "Rianikinen gave you a contract," she said. "How did you know?" "Because you walked in like someone who had just been told they were real," she said. "That's what a first contract does." He held his coffee cup and looked at the forge. Banked cooling, the iron firepot a dull red in the darkening cargo room. "I found a name in the ledger last week," he said. "A family on the east side of town, single mother, 3 kids. Cecile had mentioned her in passing." Cecile waited. "I fixed a gate hinge for her last Tuesday," he said. "She came to the door asking what she owed. I said nothing. She asked why. I told her someone had left a fund for the neighborhood and I was just working from it." Cecile looked at him. "What did she say?" "She brought her daughter to look at the forge. 16 maybe. Wren, her name is. She stood in the cargo room doorway for about 15 minutes not saying anything." Cal set his cup down. "She asked me how you make iron do what you want, not how you use the tools, how you make it do what you want. I told her heat and patience and practice. She said that sounded like most things that mattered. Then she asked if she could come back." "Did she?" "Saturday, Monday, every morning this week before school." He looked at his hands. "She's a quick study, faster than I was. Better instincts for the heat color. She reads it right without me telling her to look." Cecile held her cup and looked at the window at the depot across the street. The forge stack was visible from here, the low iron pipe above the cargo wing roof. She had watched it for 30 years, from the days when it smoked with Emmett's fire to the years it stood cold. Now it smoked again. "Emmett used to say the forge self-selected," she said. "People who needed to make things would find it, and people who didn't need to make things wouldn't notice it was there. He said you couldn't teach the need. You just had to leave the door open and see who walked through." Cecile held her cup. "You're going to need an apprentice in a few years," she said. "Maybe not that one. She's 16. "She's 16 now." They sat with that. Later, after Cecile had gone back across the street, and Cal had locked the cargo room, and climbed the stairs to the apartment he'd made in the upper floor of the main hall. A sleeping bag replaced by a real bed now. The pressed tin ceiling above him in the lamplight. The sunburst pattern throwing small shadows across the walls the same way it had since 1896. He opened Emmett's ledger to a blank page at the back. He'd bought a pen at the drugstore 2 weeks ago, the kind with a fine point that moved cleanly across paper. He'd been thinking about what to write for 2 weeks. Every day something had happened that deserved to go in the record, a small thing, a name, an act, and every day he'd thought, not yet, because he wanted the first entry to be right. Now he knew what it was. He wrote the date at the top of the page. He wrote Emmett's column headings: name, date, amount, purpose, done, because they were the right headings and because using them felt like continuity, like passing something forward that was meant to be passed. He wrote the first entry. It was Wren's family. The gate hinge. The 15 minutes in the doorway looking at the forge. The question about how you make iron do what you want. In the done column, he drew a single line. He looked at it for a moment. Emmett's 30 years of entries above it, in the large, deliberate pressing hand that grew larger and shakier toward the end. And now his entry, below them all, in his own hand, which was not yet Emmett's but which had something of the same intention behind it. Then he closed the ledger and put it back in the tin, and locked the cabinet and lay down on his bed under the pressed tin ceiling in his building in Dunmore, Michigan, 17 years old, the holder of a forge and a ledger and a first contract and one entry that was his own. He was just starting. Outside, the lake-effect wind moved off the water and across the south end of town and found the depot and went around it, the same as it had for 130 years. The building was still standing. It had been standing through every winter since 1896, through the ore boom and the rail shutdown and the long quiet and the flood and the condemnation notice, and now through this. A boy at a workbench writing the first entry in a new ledger, in a room full of tools with their outlines still waiting to be filled. The door was open. Some people inherit money. Some people inherit land. What Emmett Vane left in that cargo room was harder to measure and longer to spend. The knowledge that a town is not its buildings or its industry or the price of its lots. A town is whatever its people choose to do for each other when nobody is keeping score. Emmett kept score anyway because someone should. Now someone does.